I recently came across a story in my email, and as I started reading it, something immediately felt different. It didn't feel like the usual horror stories we're all used to. You know how those go. A family moves into a new house. Strange things begin to happen. Shadows move, doors creak, and eventually everyone gets scared. You get scared. But this story, this one was not like that. By the time I finished reading it, I wasn't just unsettled. I was genuinely afraid. Because this wasn't about ghosts or spirits or demons. It mentioned something far more disturbing, something beyond all of that. Something that, whether you realize it or not, you've probably encountered at least once in your life. Maybe you've seen it. Maybe you've felt it. Maybe you've even touched it. And that's what makes this story so terrifying. This incident dates back to the early 1990s. The exact year, the exact date, I don't know. But I do know this. The story was deliberately buried, suppressed, hidden from the public. And, as you'll find out later, there was a very specific reason for that. Because if this story had ever come out back then, someone would have definitely turned it into a movie by now. This is the story of an isolated farmhouse in rural Texas. Somewhere between the quiet, dusty stretch of land between Austin and San Antonio, there stood a large farmhouse surrounded by acres of empty fields. No neighbors nearby, no traffic, just miles of silence, broken only by the wind brushing against dry grass. The farmhouse belonged to a man named Richard Malik. Richard wasn't just any ordinary man. He was a well-known businessman, the kind of man who had built an empire from scratch. By the early 90s, he owned multiple properties across different states and had more money than he could possibly spend. But despite all that, he didn't live in Texas. He lived in Chicago with his wife, Monica. The farmhouse wasn't his home. It was more like an escape, a place he would visit once or twice a year just to get away from the chaos of city life, a quiet retreat. But a place like that, isolated, massive, and far from civilization, couldn't be left unattended. So when the farmhouse was first built, Richard hired a caretaker. His name was Daniel. Daniel had been taking care of the property for nearly 10 years. He had started working there when he was barely 20, and now, at 30, he was still there, loyal, quiet, and dependable. Richard trusted him completely. There had never been a single complaint about him, no suspicious behavior, nothing out of the ordinary. Daniel lived alone on the property, in a small quarters behind the main house. His job was simple: maintain the farmhouse, keep everything clean, and make sure the place was ready whenever Richard decided to visit. And for 10 long years, everything was perfectly normal, until one night, something changed. Whenever Daniel needed anything, he would simply call Richard, and without much delay, the item would be delivered straight to the farmhouse. Over the years, this arrangement had worked perfectly, but recently, something had changed. For the past year or two, Richard had started visiting the farmhouse almost every week. The fast-paced life in Chicago had begun to exhaust him, and he craved silence, isolation, a break from everything. The farmhouse had become more than just a vacation spot. It was now his escape. Then one day, Richard called Daniel. "I received a notice from the power department," he said. "They've scheduled a nightly outage. From 9 p.m. to 3 a.m., there won't be any electricity at all, complete shutdown." Daniel was silent for a moment before replying. "But sir, we don't have anything here. No flashlights, no lanterns, nothing like that. And honestly, I've never needed any of it. In 10 years, we've never had a single power issue out here." "I understand," Richard replied calmly. "But this isn't something you can ignore. You need to be prepared. I sent you some money last week, right? Use that. Go into town and buy whatever you need. Flashlights, lamps, batteries, anything that helps you get through the night." Daniel hesitated, but eventually said, "All right, sir, I'll go." That same afternoon, Daniel took the money and drove into town. By the time he arrived, the sun was already beginning to set. The sky had turned a dull orange, and long shadows stretched across the empty streets. He moved from one store to another, buying supplies, flashlights, spare batteries, candles, even an old kerosene lantern. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, Richard kept checking his phone. something felt off. Normally, Daniel would call him every few hours to give updates, even about the smallest things. But today, nothing. No calls, no messages. Hours had passed. Finally, unable to ignore the unease building inside him, Richard picked up his phone and called Daniel himself. The phone rang and rang. Then finally, Daniel answered. "Did you get everything?" Richard asked. "Anything left to buy?" There was a pause on the other end. Then Daniel spoke, but his voice was not the same. "Sir, can you come here today?" Richard frowned. "What? Why? What happened? Didn't you find the supplies?" "I did," Daniel said quickly, his breathing uneven. "That's not the problem. I don't feel right. Something is wrong. Very wrong." Richard sat up straight. "What do you mean?" "I don't know how to explain it," Daniel said, his voice trembling now. "Ever since I got here, things feel strange. It's like something is watching me. I can't breathe properly. My chest feels tight, and..." He paused, as if struggling to say the words. "It feels like death is standing right in front of me." A cold silence filled the line. Richard tried to steady his voice. "Listen to me. I was already planning to come there in 2 days. But if something's wrong, I'll come sooner. The problem is, I'm not in Chicago right now. I'm in New York for work. Please, sir," Daniel whispered, "come as soon as you can." "I'll try to book the earliest flight," Richard said. "I'll leave first thing tomorrow morning and head straight to the farmhouse. Just stay calm, all right? Lock the doors. Don't go outside at night." But even as he said those words, Richard had a strange feeling. Something had already begun, and whatever it wasn't going to wait until morning. For now, Richard had said on the call, his voice trying to stay steady, "Just listen to me carefully. If you feel safe inside, stay inside. If you think it's better to be outside, then stay outside. I'm leaving this decision to you. I'll be there tomorrow." The call ended. The next day, as soon as Richard reached Chicago, he didn't waste a second. He got into his car and began the long drive toward the farmhouse in Texas. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of him, but something inside him kept tightening with every mile, and the moment he finally arrived, he knew. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Earlier, whenever he used to come here, the place would feel alive. Music would echo faintly from the house. Daniel always had something playing in the background. He would be waiting near the gate, smiling, ready to welcome him in. But today, there was nothing. No music, no movement, no sign of life. What disturbed Richard the most was this. Daniel wasn't there at the gate. In 10 years, not once had that happened. Richard slowly drove through the gate and parked his car in front of the farmhouse. He stepped out, looking around carefully. The air felt heavy, unnaturally still. He walked inside the house. "Daniel," he called out. No response. He checked every room, the kitchen, the living area, the back quarters. Nothing. A strange uneasiness began to crawl up his spine. He stepped outside again and looked toward the fields. Maybe Daniel was working there, but the fields were empty, silent under the fading evening light. Where the hell did he go? Richard muttered to himself. It was only around 5:30 p.m., too early for him to just disappear. Then his eyes shifted toward the barn. One small detail caught his attention. The fan inside the barn was running. Without thinking, Richard hurried toward it. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The animals stood quietly in their places. No unusual movement, no sounds, except the low, occasional shifting of hooves. But something about the silence felt wrong. It wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. Then, suddenly, his eyes fell on a corner of the barn. And there, curled up against the wall, was Daniel. He was trembling, his entire body shaking as if he had been sitting there for hours. "Daniel!" Richard rushed toward him and placed a hand on his shoulder. The moment Daniel looked up at him, his face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Sir," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're not scared?" Richard frowned. "Scared? Of what?" Daniel's lips trembled. of that thing standing behind you. For a split second, Richard's heart skipped. He turned around sharply. There was nothing there, just empty space. He let out a breath and turned back, slightly irritated now. "What are you talking about? There's nothing behind me. Why are you saying things like that?" Daniel shook his head slowly, his eyes still fixed somewhere over Richard's shoulder. "Maybe you can't see it, sir," he whispered. "But I can. It's right there, still standing behind you." Richard stared at him, now convinced that something had deeply shaken him. He looked around and spotted a steel cup lying nearby. Filling it with water, he handed it to Daniel. "Here, drink this. Calm down," he said firmly. "And now, tell me everything properly. What happened here?" Daniel took the glass with trembling hands. He drank a sip, then another, trying to steady his breath. After a few seconds, he finally spoke. "Sir, this started yesterday evening." His voice was still shaky. "I had bought all the supplies from town and was heading back to the farmhouse. By then, the sun had already set. There was barely any light left, and the flashlight and emergency lamps I bought weren't even charged yet." He swallowed hard. "As I reached near the farmhouse gate, I suddenly felt something." Richard leaned closer. "What?" Daniel's grip tightened around the glass. "It felt like I wasn't alone." He paused, looking around as if the memory itself was watching him. "The entire road behind me was empty, silent. No cars, no people, nothing. But even then, I could feel it." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Something was there with me." "No cars passed by, not a single sound on the road," Daniel continued, his voice trembling as he stared blankly ahead. "It was just me, alone, carrying those supplies in my hands. And still, I couldn't shake that feeling." He swallowed hard. "It felt like someone else was walking with me." Richard didn't interrupt. He could see the fear wasn't fake. It was carved deep into Daniel's face. "I ignored it somehow," Daniel went on. "I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I unlocked the gate, pushed it open, and stepped inside." He paused, and the moment I stepped in, it felt like I wasn't the only one who entered. A cold silence filled the barn. "I don't know how to explain it, sir," he said quietly. "But it was like something came in with me." Richard felt a slight chill run down his back, but he stayed composed. "Go on." A little time passed. I installed all the emergency lights around the house. After that, I started cooking dinner like I always do. Everything felt normal, at least on the surface. He tightened his grip on the empty glass. But every now and then, I felt like someone was walking around the house, just circling it. His breathing grew uneven again. I kept telling myself, who could it be? The whole property is fenced. No one can just walk in like that. So I ignored it. He let out a shaky breath. Dinner was ready. I sat down at the dining table to eat. For a moment, he stopped speaking, as if replaying the scene in his mind. Then suddenly, I saw it. Richard leaned in slightly. Saw what? Daniel's eyes widened. Someone standing outside the window. His voice dropped to a whisper, peeking in, looking straight at me. A faint tremor ran through his hands. And not just looking, he added. It was smiling. Richard felt his chest tighten. I thought maybe it was some stranger, maybe someone who somehow got inside the property, so I tried to look carefully. I leaned forward to see the face clearly. He shook his head slowly, but when I focused, it was gone. Silence. Just gone. Daniel closed his eyes for a second, trying to control himself. That's when I started getting really scared, sir. I stood up immediately. I rushed through my food. I just wanted to finish everything and get out of there. He continued, his voice now almost shaky enough to break. After eating, I thought I'd step outside and wash my hands. But even while walking out, I had this feeling that whoever or whatever was there was still around the farmhouse. Richard didn't say a word. Daniel looked at him. I thought, maybe I'll finally see it outside. He took a deep breath. I went out. I was washing my hands. There was no sound nearby. Everything was dead silent. Then his expression changed. But right in front of me, the fields. He pointed vaguely ahead, as if the scene was still there. I felt like something was moving inside them, like something was wandering there. Richard frowned. At that time? Daniel nodded slowly. It's impossible for anyone to be walking inside those fields at night, sir. But I could hear it, faint sounds, like something brushing against the crops. His voice cracked, and just as I went to switch on the field lights, he stopped. The entire farmhouse went dark. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. The power cut, Daniel said, almost whispering now. I remembered what you told me, that there would be no electricity from 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. He looked down at his shaking hands. I was already terrified by then, but I ran inside anyway, straight toward the emergency lights. I was fumbling with them, trying to turn them on. My hands weren't even working properly. He inhaled sharply. And then, I finally switched one on. For a moment, he didn't speak. When the light came on, he looked up at Richard, his eyes filled with pure horror. I saw it. Richard's heartbeat quickened. What did you see? Daniel's lips trembled. Right next to me, standing so close, his voice dropped to a broken whisper. There was a tall woman. A long pause, but she had no head. The barn seemed to grow colder. It was just standing there, Daniel continued, barely able to speak now. Completely still, but I could feel it looking at me, even without a face. He shut his eyes tightly. I didn't wait. I didn't think. I dropped everything, grabbed one emergency light, and ran. He looked around the barn weakly. I came here, and I've been sitting here since last night. I didn't move. I didn't go back. I just stayed here, waiting. Silence fell again. Richard stood there, processing everything. His logical mind tried to reject it. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. But the fear in Daniel's eyes, that wasn't something you could fake. Still, Richard shook his head slightly, trying to ground himself. This doesn't make any sense, he muttered. There has to be some explanation. Hallucination, stress, something. But deep down, even he wasn't fully convinced anymore. But sir, all of this really happened to me, Daniel insisted, his voice filled with desperation. Why would I joke about something like this? I spent the entire night here, in this barn, because I was too scared to go back. Richard exhaled sharply, trying to stay rational. Daniel, listen to yourself, he said firmly. I've been coming here for years. You've been here for 10. Nothing like this has ever happened. Don't start imagining things now. There has to be a logical explanation. Daniel shook his head, almost pleading. No, sir, you don't understand. I know what I saw, and tonight, you'll see it too. Something about the certainty in his voice lingered for a second, but Richard brushed it off. Enough, he said, cutting him off. If you're that scared, stay here. I'm not forcing you, but at least give me my dinner. I'm exhausted. I came all this way thinking something serious had happened, and this is what I find. Daniel lowered his eyes. All right, sir. I won't come inside. I'll cook and send your food there. Without another word, Richard turned and walked back toward the house. Inside, everything looked normal, too normal. He changed his clothes, then went to take a shower. The warm water helped him relax a little, washing away the dust of the long journey. By the time he came out, he felt calmer, almost convinced that Daniel had simply panicked over nothing. He sat quietly for a while. Then, preparing to sleep, he took everything out of his pockets, his car keys, house keys, wallet, and placed them neatly on the bedside table. The room was dimly lit. He pulled the blanket over himself, ready to finally rest. And just as he was about to close his eyes, creak. The sound of the farmhouse's main door opening echoed faintly through the silence. Richard frowned. "Daniel," he muttered under his breath. "Looks like he changed his mind." But before he could relax, crash! The sharp sound of glass shattering rang through the house. Richard froze. A sudden wave of fear rushed through him. He wasn't a brave man, not really. Even small, unexpected noises made him uneasy, and on top of that, he already had a history of heart problems. He had survived a heart attack once before. Barely. His heartbeat started to rise. Still, gathering whatever courage he had, he slowly got out of bed and stepped out of his bedroom. The hallway was dark, and then, for a split second, he saw it. A figure, a man, running past him, right in front of his eyes, moving quickly toward the living hall. Richard's breath caught in his throat. "Hey, who's there?" he shouted, his voice shaking. "Who are you?" No response, just silence. His fear growing, he followed the direction where he had seen the figure run. Step by step, he moved toward the hall. "Who's there?" he called again. Nothing. His hands trembled as he reached for the switch. Click, the lights came on, and the hall was empty, completely empty. Richard stood still, scanning every corner. No one, not a single soul. After a few seconds, he let out a nervous breath. "Maybe I'm just tired," he muttered. "Yeah, that's all." He turned the lights off again. Darkness swallowed the room, and as he turned back to go to his bedroom, from somewhere behind him, a faint sound echoed. Laughter, soft, slow, and not human. Richard's body went cold. He froze in place for a second, then quickly turned back and switched the lights on again. The hall was empty. Nothing. No one. He stood there, breathing heavily. No, this is just in my head," he whispered to himself. "I'm exhausted. That's it. I just need sleep." Trying to convince himself, he turned away once more and walked back toward his bedroom. But now, even he wasn't so sure anymore. He turned the lights off again. Darkness swallowed everything, and instantly, that same laughter echoed again, but this time, it wasn't alone. Something else followed it. A sharp crack, as if something had just been broken. Richard's heart slammed against his chest. Without wasting a second, he rushed to turn the lights back on. Click. Nothing. The lights didn't come on. For a brief moment, confusion crossed his face. Then instinctively, he glanced down at his wristwatch. 9:00 p.m. The power was gone, and it wouldn't return until 3 in the morning. A cold realization sank in. Everything Daniel had said was true. Richard felt the ground beneath him shift, not physically, but mentally. His confidence, his logic, his disbelief, all of it began to crumble. "What the hell is happening?" he whispered. Panic started creeping in. Without thinking further, he turned and ran out of the house, straight toward the barn. "Daniel!" he shouted as he ran. "Daniel!" He reached the barn, pushed the door open. Empty. Daniel wasn't there. Richard froze. For a second, his mind went blank. Did he run away? He muttered to himself. And then it hit him. Of course he ran. After everything that had happened, why wouldn't he? Which meant he wasn't lying. Every single thing he said was real. And now, it's happening to me, Richard whispered, his voice breaking. A terrifying thought followed immediately. And it's not over yet. I need to get out of here, he said to himself. That was the only option left. He turned and ran toward his car, which was parked right in front of the house. Even as he ran, he could still hear faint sounds coming from inside the farmhouse. Movements, whispers, something shifting, but he didn't look back. He reached the car, grabbed the handle, and tried to open it. Locked. Come on, he muttered, his hands shaking. He quickly reached into his pockets. Nothing. No keys. He checked again and again. Nothing. Then suddenly, it hit him. The keys. His face went pale. They're inside. He remembered clearly. He had left them on the bedside table, inside the bedroom, inside the house, inside that place. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing heavily. The car was right in front of him. Freedom, just a few steps away, but completely out of reach. "I'm stuck," he whispered. It felt like a trap, a perfectly designed trap. "How do I go back in there?" he muttered, his voice trembling. "How do I walk into that again?" But he had no choice. Either he goes back, or he stays here. And staying out here in the darkness didn't feel any safer. He closed his eyes for a second, trying to gather courage. "What's the worst that could happen?" he said to himself weakly. "Maybe it's all just in my head. I've never believed in this stuff. So why now? Just some noises, that's all. Could be the wind." Repeating this over and over, he slowly turned back toward the house, step by step. He walked inside again. The darkness felt heavier this time, more alive. He looked around carefully. Nothing. No one. "It's all in my head. It's all in my head," he kept whispering to himself, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He reached his bedroom. His hands quickly grabbed everything from the side table, his car keys, house keys, anything he had left there. "Got it. Just leave now," he muttered. Turning around, he walked toward the main door. Just a few more steps, just a few more seconds. Freedom. He reached the door. His hand moved toward the handle, and just as he was about to open it, a sound came from the kitchen. He froze. It wasn't random noise. It sounded like someone was there, moving, maybe even talking. Richard's breath slowed. A thought crossed his mind. Daniel? Maybe he had come back. Maybe he was inside. Holding on to that small hope, Richard slowly turned away from the door and began walking toward the kitchen. He stepped into the kitchen slowly. The dim emergency light barely reached that far, leaving most of the space drowned in shadows. "Daniel," Richard called out cautiously. No answer. He walked closer. The kitchen platform stood empty. No one was there. A strange confusion crossed his face. "I swear I heard someone," he muttered. And then, a feeling, sudden, intense, as if someone was standing right behind him, so close that he could hear it breathing. Heavy, uneven, mirroring his own breaths. Richard's body went stiff. His heart began to race uncontrollably, slowly, almost mechanically. He turned around, and the moment he did, there it was, a man, standing right in front of him, so close that their faces were barely a foot apart. Richard didn't even get the chance to react. His eyes widened, and everything went black. He collapsed on the floor, unconscious. Hours passed. The farmhouse remained silent, dark, heavy. Time moved slowly in that suffocating stillness. Then, faint sounds, voices, something stirred. Richard's fingers twitched slightly, his eyes slowly opened. His vision was blurry at first, his head spinning. The first thing he saw, his wristwatch, 2:50 a.m., 10 minutes until the power would return. He tried to stay still, his breathing shallow. Then, his eyes shifted forward, and what he saw next froze him completely. A man was standing a few feet away from him, in the darkness, facing away, talking on the phone. "I could only knock him unconscious, ma'am," the man said in a low voice. "He didn't have a heart attack. If you want, I can bury him in the field next to the house." Richard's blood ran cold. He didn't move, didn't speak. For 10 long minutes, he just lay there, pretending to be unconscious, listening to every word. His mind raced. Who is this? Why is he here? What do they want from me? But he stayed still, waiting for the one thing that could change everything. The lights. Finally. 3 a.m., click. The electricity returned. The entire house lit up in an instant, and in that very moment, Richard sprang to his feet. Before the man could react, Richard grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter and pressed it tightly against the man's throat. "Who are you?" he shouted, his voice filled with rage and fear. The man froze. Slowly, he turned around, and the moment his face came into the light, Richard's world shattered. Daniel? It was him. The same man he had trusted for 10 years. The same man he had treated like family. And now, standing in front of him like this, betraying him. Richard's grip tightened on the knife. "Why?" he demanded. "Why are you doing this? Who told you to do all this?" Before Daniel could answer, his phone rang. Both of them froze. Daniel slowly took out his phone. The screen lit up, and the name on it made Richard's heart sink even deeper. Monica calling, his wife. Richard's voice turned cold. "Don't say anything different," he warned. "Talk exactly the way you were talking 10 minutes ago. Put it on speaker." Daniel nodded nervously. He answered the call and switched it to speaker. "Hello?" he said. On the other end, Monica's voice came through, calm, almost impatient. "It's done, right?" she said. "You killed him?" Richard closed his eyes for a second. "And don't worry," she continued. "I've already spoken to the lawyer. I'll transfer 5% of his property to you. You always liked that farmhouse, didn't you? Keep 5% of that, too." Silence filled the kitchen. Then Daniel spoke, his voice shaking. "No, ma'am. I didn't kill him." A pause. "And I don't think I'll be able to," he added quietly, "because he's standing right in front of me." Another silence, heavy, uncomfortable. "And he has a knife at my throat," Daniel finished. There was no response from the other side, not a single word. Richard finally spoke. "Monica," he said, his voice low but steady. "Come here, right now." Still silence. "If you wanted a share of my property, if you wanted anything at all," he continued, "you could have just asked me." His grip on the knife didn't loosen. "Why all this?" he demanded. "Why this drama?" "Good," Richard said coldly into the phone. "Come here. You want your share of the property, right? I'll give it to you, face to face. I'm right here. Come." There was a brief pause. Then Monica replied, her tone calm, almost satisfied. "Fine. If you're ready to settle this peacefully, then I don't need anything else. I just want what's mine. I'm on my way. It'll take me about an hour and a half. Stay there." The call ended. Silence returned. For the next hour and a half, Richard and Daniel remained inside the farmhouse. Neither of them truly relaxed. Daniel stood there, his head lowered, guilt written all over his face. He couldn't even look Richard in the eyes. "I'm sorry, sir," he finally muttered. Richard shook his head slowly. "This isn't your fault," he said in a steady voice. "You're just a pawn, following the orders of a queen." Daniel looked up slightly. "But remember one thing," Richard continued, his tone turning sharper. "I'm the king, and a game of chess doesn't end until the king falls." The words hung heavy in the air. Time crawled. They moved around the house restlessly, both waiting, both thinking. Then, a distant sound broke the silence. A car horn. Richard's expression hardened instantly. "She's here." A few seconds later, knock, knock. The sound of someone at the door echoed through the house. Richard turned to Daniel. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Then Richard spoke, his voice low but decisive. "This entire property, the land you're standing on right now, I'll give you 10% of it." Daniel didn't react. He just stood there, frozen. "And when she walks in," Richard continued, "you kill her." Silence. Daniel said nothing. Slowly, he turned and walked toward the door. He opened it. Monica stepped inside. She looked calm, confident, almost relieved. "Good," she said with a faint smile. "I'm glad you finally came to your senses, Richard. Otherwise, who knows what Daniel might have done to you." Daniel stood right beside her, quiet, still. Then he spoke. "Ma'am, I told you on the call." His voice was flat. "This time, it's yours." Before she could even process his words, Daniel drove the knife straight into her chest. A sharp, brutal motion. The blade pierced through. Monica's eyes widened in shock. She collapsed to the floor almost instantly. Blood began to spread across the ground. The room fell silent again. Daniel stood there, frozen, staring at what he had just done. Then slowly, he looked at Richard. Richard, on the other hand, was looking down at Monica's lifeless body, and he was smiling, a faint, unsettling smile. "You remember what I told you on the call?" Richard said calmly. "That I was going to come here in 2 days for something important." Daniel nodded weakly. "Yes," Richard exhaled. "I sold this farmhouse a week ago." Daniel's eyes widened. "I've already taken all the money," Richard continued. "This place isn't even mine anymore. I only came here to collect my belongings, to shift everything, and to inform you as well." He shrugged slightly, but, well, things turned out differently. Daniel's hands began to tremble. The knife slipped from his grip and clattered onto the floor. He grabbed his head, dropping to his knees. 10 years, he whispered, his voice breaking. "I was loyal to you for 10 years, and today, just because of 5%, 10%, I betrayed you." Tears filled his eyes. "I killed your wife. I turned against the man who trusted me." His voice cracked completely. "What do I even do now?" But Richard didn't seem to care. Not about Daniel's guilt, not about Monica's death, not about anything. He just stood there, silent, distant, as if none of this mattered anymore. And somewhere, deep inside that farmhouse, the darkness still hadn't left. For a moment, Richard just stood there, watching. Then he let out a slow breath, almost as if he was bored of everything that had just happened. "This was a waste of my time," he muttered coldly. "I knew this would happen. I knew what kind of person my wife was, and I guess I knew what kind of person you were too." Daniel didn't respond. He couldn't. Richard turned away, stepped over Monica's lifeless body without a second glance, and walked straight out of the farmhouse. The night air felt different now, quieter. He reached his car, opened the door, got inside, and drove off, leaving everything behind, just like that, just like. A few days later, the news broke. It spread quietly at first, then faster. People began talking, rumors began forming. The official story was simple. The caretaker of the farmhouse had murdered his employer's wife out of personal hatred. Some even claimed that there had been an illicit relationship between the caretaker and the woman, that things had gone too far and ended in violence, and in the end, consumed by guilt, the caretaker had taken his own life. That's what people believed. That's what everyone accepted. And Richard? He became the victim in everyone's eyes, a man betrayed by both his wife and a loyal employee. No one questioned him. No one doubted him. No one looked deeper. Because the truth, the real truth, was buried inside that farmhouse, and Richard made sure it stayed that way. He never told anyone what really happened that night. Not the voices, not the shadows, not the thing Daniel had seen, not even the part where, for a brief moment, he himself had started believing. But the truth has a strange way of leaking out, piece by piece, through whispers, through family, through fragments of conversations that refuse to stay hidden. And that's how this story eventually surfaced. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about ghosts or shadows or something unnatural. It was about something far more dangerous, something very human. Greed, desire, betrayal. These things don't just destroy lives, they invite something else in. Something you don't see at first, something that watches, waits, and feeds on the darkness inside people. So if there's one thing to take from this story, it's this. A little greed is natural, like sugar. Everyone likes it, but only in the right amount. Because too much of it doesn't just ruin you, it ends you. And maybe, just maybe, whatever was in that farmhouse that night was never a ghost at all. If you enjoyed this story and want more real, terrifying, and mysterious horror content like this, don't forget to hit the like button. And make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story, because the next one might be even darker than this one. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next horror story.